there any questions?
Which neuron transmitter give the information from the neuron that attached to the cochlea and the other neuron that attached to the center of the brainstem? Which neurotransmitter is it? Do you know?
Which neurotransmitter or which neurons?
No, the neurons act with neurotransmitters, so we know now which neurotransmitter is responsible to the transmitter of the message.
You have glycinergic and GABAergic. You have excitation and inhibition. There's a combination of glycine and GABA because you have excitation that brings together. I'll show you on this slide. I didn't go into the detail, but what you have going in to the MSO are excitatory inputs, but you also have coming inhibitory inputs from the other side. And the brain is comparing excitation and inhibition, which is what makes the tuning sharp. Does that help? Yeah, good.
If I may, because you leave this slide for a long time, then I must know what you mean by ITD in ongoing stimulus and in onset and IMDs throughout.
Okay, yeah, this is a lot of detail, which I'm always happy to talk about. Yeah. So if you turn on a sound like a click, right, very quick sound, you only have onset cues. And sometimes in speech, really what we have are onset cues, right? So ITD in the onset is very important, but speech also keeps going, and so now you also have ITD in the ongoing stimulus, okay? And then the ILD, the interoral level difference, is always there because sounds are always with the same level differences, okay? Good. This is a good slide. I can give you the slides if you want for your notes so that you can use them for teaching or whatever. Okay. So the idea is that you got the inner hair cells in the cochlea, and very quickly you got one synapse, and then you go to the brainstem. And what I will show you later is that I think the auditory nerve dies down without stimulation, and you can see that these circuits are not getting the information that they need very, very early on in the process. We were talking earlier about how a long time ago, I think the research that he was doing was 1944, 1945. The paper happened to be published in 1948, which I know, of course, very historical year, here in Israel. But at the same time, engineers in California were doing very interesting work. There was no information then about the brain because that work was done in the 1960s and in the 1970s. But a very smart engineer called Jeffress, he was kind of a crazy guy really, but he said, I believe that the way we localize sound, I believe that the brain must have a special mechanism that does this. And he put together a very beautiful model of what he thought the brainstem did. And ever since then, it's been a long time, over 60 years, scientists are still going back to the Jeffress model. Anytime you talk to anyone on binaural hearing, the first thing, Jeffress, because he came up with this idea, and I will show you, it's a little video, some of you have seen it, of the nucleus, the MSO. And what he said, which happens to be mostly true, we have the cochlea, auditory nerve, cochlear nucleus. And now you see this. This is the axon of the neuron. And it's long. It goes like this. Woo. And then from this side, you have an axon, which is a little shorter. But maybe by the time it gets to over here, the sound gets there at the same time. The theory is with, I don't know if you know the word coincidence. It's like it happened to be at the same time. The theory is that the anatomy is built, the axons are built in a way that the length, how long the axons are, means that the sound from here and here will come to a different neuron than the sound from here and here. And I'll show you a little simulation of that. So we have a sound wave, and it's moving through the slide. And now you see the sound lights up, and we have a magical neuron that says, ah, I heard that. Let's look at it again slower. The sound comes through, and now the information travels down the axon, and it's looking for the neuron. It's looking for where it's going to meet the information from the other side. So this neuron said, ooh, that came at this time from both left and right. Now the sound comes from over here. So now a different neuron will say, ooh, I got the information at the same time. So it's about the axon length and the timing. Right? So before we heard number 2, now we're hearing it at number 6. So there's like a network of neurons. Some are paying attention to sound from over there, and some are paying attention to sound from over there. This is the main idea. And if you imagine, I'll just repeat the same information, but we imagine that we have a group of neurons. They're sitting in the brainstem. You've got all these axons from the left ear, and you've got axons from the right ear. And these neurons are asking, okay, where did the sound come from? And you can imagine a sound might come from the side, and so you get information from the right and the left, and they find the sweet spot, the magic neuron, that says, ooh, okay, the sound came from over there. And if I ask the neuron, if I put my electrode, I do an experiment, and I take an electrode, and I put the electrode in the neuron, and they did all these experiments where I teach in Wisconsin in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I move the sound in space. What the neuron will tell you, because the neuron gives you action potentials, is the neuron says, no, I don't like this. There's no action potentials. And then it will give you a lot of responses at a specific location. So the neurons are paying attention to location. It's called tuning, right? When you tune to a certain location. And another neuron might like a different location. And so we have a map of neurons for location, for localization. Okay. I think I'm going to skip that slide. But the summary is that we have, you were asking what, this is the medial superior olive, one nucleus, and another nucleus, the lateral, the LSO. We have a map of low frequencies and high frequencies. We have time, and we have level, which is also intensity. Okay.
And where we have both?
Okay, then you move up in the brain, and they combine again.
Where?
In the inferior colliculus. They combine again when you move up to the inferior colliculus, and then in the cortex. Question? Okay. I mentioned earlier, and I'll say this again, which is that ITDs, which I make a big deal of, are not something that people with cochlear implants have in a very good way. It's really a bad thing that cochlear implants don't give you ITDs. And later, in the 3rd or 4th lecture, I will talk about people who don't localize well with cochlear implants. And what I hope you might remember from now is that one of the reasons is that they don't have ITDs that are very good. But what they do have, which might help them, is this. Imagine that this is like a simple speech sound, which goes like that in time. And imagine that we can compare the right and the left ear, and you can see that some of the information comes before some of the other information. So I think this can help us with cochlear implants, and I can get back to it a little bit later. Okay, so binaural hearing helps with sound localization, unmasking of speech, and bringing down the problem from echoes. So let's talk about the cocktail party effect, right? The idea that it's hard to hear speech in a noisy environment. So what we're going to listen to now is two different sentences. One sentence was recorded, these are sentences from the 1960s, but we like to use them for research. Do you have them in Hebrew, the IEEEs? No, you have CUNY sentences, right? Okay. So you're going to hear a target sentence, a boy fell from the window, and it's going to come, I'm using virtual reality, but, in the speakers, but I think you'll get the demonstration, okay? See if you can hear the target speech, a boy fell from the window, and it's coming with sound that has a lot of intensity in the left ear. And I will either play it when you have binaural hearing or you have good hearing near the target, or when you can hear from the right ear, but you've got another sound at the same time, which is competing, and it should be making it harder. So let's listen first to the right ear and see if you can hear the sentence, a boy fell from the window. It should be difficult from the right ear.
The wife helped your husband.
I'll play it again.
The wife helped your husband.
Did anybody hear a boy fell from the window? It's very difficult because you don't have good signal to noise ratio for something that's coming from all the way here, only in this ear. Now let's turn off the right ear and let's listen in the left ear.
A boy fell from the window.
How many people could hear a boy fell from the window? Okay, good. So you can see, that's good. So you can see that when you have the sound that you're listening to and it's near an ear that works, okay, fine. But the minute that ear goes off, if all you have is this one, you're going to be in trouble. So now we'll play it binaurally, and let's see if you can pay attention and hear a boy fell from the window.
A wife helped your husband.
Right, you hear two things, depending on where you're sitting and where the speakers are, but you should be able to do what we call source segregation. You are segregating, right? We segregate.
How would you translate the word segregation?
Chilutz. הפרשה? הפרדה. Okay, you can argue. The idea is you are segregating target from noise. Okay?
את המשפט המטרה, אומרים לו את זה קודם? הבן אדם יודע למה הוא מצפה או לא?
I'll repeat the question. The target sentence, do you tell the person what it's going to be? No. What you tell the person is what the competitor is. You say to the person, ignore this one. Ignore this one. Now, I do an experiment, and I have 100 targets. And I want to know % correct. So I play this, I say, ignore this one, and tell me what you hear. So one sentence could be, a boy fell from the window. Okay, I see how many words you got correct. Next sentence, potatoes grow in the field, or whatever the sentences are. Right? So I do this 100 times with different targets. And then I see % correct.
Because in this בדוגמה שאנחנו שמענו, אנחנו ידענו את המשפט המטרה.
Yeah, in the example, you knew the target because I made it easy for you. But if you didn't know, I'll show you other examples later where I won't tell you what the target, but that's the idea, right? So for binaural hearing, the way we do experiments, and people I know here do this in clinics sometimes also, but there's a lot of science behind this, is that you now take your target speech, you don't tell the listener what the speech is. This is the test. What did you hear? Now, you can have your competitors, or whatever you call them, maskers, either in the same location, right? So now I have target speech and I have the noise, the same location, Right, the last example, they were on the right and on the left, right? We can also do an experiment where I bring them together, which is very difficult when they're coming from the same location, or I take the noise and I put it on the side. Now, what you should be able to do, if I take the noise and I put it on the side, is if you're listening to the speech over here, with the noise on the side, what do you have over here? You have an ear that has a good signal-to-noise ratio for the target. But the masker, or the interferer, the noise, by the time it gets to this ear, should be lower. So this is a very important cue for, now we call this spatial, because you have spatial information, and it's called release from masking. Why is it called release from masking? Because you have target alone. Now you add the noise, and you have masking, which means it's more difficult to hear the noise. Now the question is, can I make it easier for you if the noise is still there? Well, if I take the masker or the noise and I move it to the side, you should get better. So you should get what's called release from masking. And we call it SRM, which is spatial release from masking. Okay? Okay, so you take somebody with normal hearing and you do an experiment with virtual. You see, I like virtual reality because you can manipulate the sounds very easily. You take the sounds through headphones, you have all the spatial cues, and now you can be very clever. You can say, okay, I'll turn off the right ear, or I will turn off the left ear. You can do a lot of clever things with virtual reality. So we did a study that was published in 2004 with normal hearing people. And what you see, I'll go back here, is that this is what happens. I measure speech perception when I have target and masker in front, and then I move the masker to the side. And the question is, by how much did I get better? So if I get better, it means I can hear the target at a lower dB. Right? Let's imagine in this condition, I need the target at 70 decibels in order to hear the target. And now if I move the masker to the side, now I can hear the target at 58 dB. So how much did I improve? 70 down to 58, I improved by 12 dB. What if from 70 I have to only go to 65? Then I only improve by 5 dB. Right? What if I get worse? Okay, then you have anti-release from masking. This happens sometimes for people when they wear 2 cochlear implants or a cochlear implant and a hearing aid, and you move it to the side. You're putting it actually near an ear that isn't very good, and then it's worse. Now, in normal hearing listeners, this is what we see. Binaural hearing gives you about 10 dB improvement. So you go down from 70 to 60. It's a big improvement. 10 dB is huge. Sorry, I didn't mean binaural hearing. I meant the total, everything that you have together. Because total has both binaural hearing and you have some head shadow cue. Now, with virtual reality, I can be very clever. I can manipulate the sounds, and I can turn off one ear or the other so I can see monaural, binaural. So now if I move the sound in a way that I only give the person more monaural cues, I get 4 dB improvement. And binaural is about 6. Okay, so normal hearing people get better by 10 dB, but 6 dB comes from binaural circuits. And I'm telling you this now because hopefully I'll get later to showing you data in which we look at this not in normal hearing people, but people who have bilateral cochlear implants. And unfortunately, all of the benefit they get is from monaural head shadow, because they have 2 implants, but the implants don't work together. And so they don't have binaural hearing. They have bilateral, which is why I think it's important that we call it bilateral, and we don't talk about them as having binaural. Some of the cochlear implant companies like to use the word binaural, but I think it's wrong. And I think we have to be careful not to use that term, because the engineering isn't binaural right now. They're separate implants. Okay. Now, for normal hearing people, you can do experiments in which you vary the type of noise in the environment. So you can have speech, like we used a minute ago. You can have noise. A lot of the clinics, you use noise, right? Noise, or noise that moves in time. You can also have reversed speech. And unfortunately, I tried to get the demo to work this morning, and it wasn't working, and I gave up. But what I want to tell you is about the results, right? We can do the same experiment here. This is with speech. And we can also do it with time reverse speech. Time reverse is where you take the speech and you play it backward, and it sounds like speech, but it sounds like speech that you don't understand. Okay? But in the clinic for many, many years, and if you buy audiometers and if you buy tests for the clinic, they always give you noise as the background. And I think that noise doesn't tell you about the benefit of binaural hearing. I think that speech or reverse speech tell you more about binaural hearing, and noise isn't so good. And the reason is that speech and reverse speech it's more cognitive, it demands more attention, and we call this informational masking, where the information in the speech or the information in the noise gets confused. And so you get confused about what you're listening for. When you were listening to A Boy Fell from the Window, A Wife Helped Her Husband, there's a lot of speech going on, and you can get confused. But noise is just pshh, and you can ignore the noise. So for binaural hearing, if you want to do testing that shows you the benefits, I think you have to use speech or reverse speech. And question.
There's something you said before. In general, cochlear implants are bilateral. It may give bilateral hearing, and probably not such a good.
Do you want to use the
binaural hearing.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that they don't give it at all.
Yeah.
Because you use your test, and you know that to some extent they can separate information and noise from the target
Yeah.
speech. So we learned it from you, of course, but we see it every day.
Yes. The question was, we should argue about this later. When I talk about bilateral implants, the question is, really, do they never give you any binaural hearing? I think that what cochlear implants that are in 2 ears don't give you is binaural hearing that is consistent. I think that's the problem. Yeah. Okay.
Agree.
Yeah. Okay, good. So now let's look at, what did we call this? Spatial release from masking, which is the benefit that you get when you separate target speech from the competitors or from the noise. Okay? So let's look at how much better you get with noise when it's noise or when it's speech or reverse speech. Okay? Now, on this axis is the advantage, or how much better you get in dB sound pressure level. So by how much do you get better? And the axis is from 0 to 12 dB. Okay, now what we have here is 1, 2, or 3. So at the same time, is there one person or 2 people or 3 people? Because you know that if one person is talking over there and I'm listening to you, I can maybe ignore that person. But 2 people start talking, it's harder. 3 people, there's a lot of information, and it's much, much harder. So binaural hearing helps you more when there are 2 talkers and when the 2 talkers are speech. And this is how we know from our experiments. The advantage is 10, 12 dB when you have 2 or 3 talkers, and it's the red and the blue, which is the speech and the reverse speech. So when you have speech or reverse speech, which is information, it's cognitive, it demands attention, that's when binaural hearing makes a big difference. Okay? When you have noise or noise that is modulated, it sounds psh, 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 but it's noise, there's no information, you get benefit, you get advantage, but it's about 6 dB. And it doesn't change if you add 2 noise or 3 noise. Okay, so there are two important pieces of information. You get advantage of separation when you have more sources in the cocktail party effect, 2 or 3, especially if it's speech or reverse speech, because it demands cognition, it demands attention, it's informational masking. Okay. So the summary for this part is that we have binaural circuits which are specialized for time and level differences between the ears. This is good for localization, and we also talked about speech and noise. And the separation of speech and noise, especially binaural hearing, is when the noise has linguistic content or context, right? This is not information. You don't hear it because it's backward speech, but you know somebody's talking, and it's the context. It's the context of language. Okay. Wow, so I'm really on time. But this was part 1. And the idea is I will move into part 2, but this would be a good time to stop and take a breath and ask questions, or if somebody needs the bathroom. What do you think? Any questions? Things I didn't cover? Things I should go over?
I didn't understand exactly the anti-SRM, how it happens.
Okay, do you want to?
I didn't understand exactly the anti-SRM, how it happens.
So the question was the anti-release from masking. It's an interesting idea. So I went over it very fast, and I didn't show you data, but this is the idea. There are some very successful people who are very successful at putting together, for example, a cochlear implant in one ear and a hearing aid in the other ear. And we have somebody here who I think is a good example. But often in the clinic, they say, okay, you have a cochlear implant, you have some residual hearing in the other ear, let's put a hearing aid on because we want to stimulate. Right? That's the idea. Let's make sure we stimulate. And I always say, well, okay, you stimulate, but maybe when you stimulate, there isn't much there. Maybe you're bringing up the audiogram, but maybe you're adding noise to the system. And what we find in some children, I don't have data on adults on this, but what we find in some children is that when you put the hearing aid on, it helps the child with localizing. But when I do the test on spatial release from masking, when I put the noise near the hearing aid, they get worse. Not only do they not get better, they get worse. And I think it's because you're adding noise near the hearing aid. It's already not a very good ear to begin with. So I've always recommended to people who fit children that you shouldn't just fit and measure audibility. It's okay that audibility is getting better, but it doesn't mean that audibility is making better functionality. You have audibility and you have function. And you could be making audibility better, but functionally it's worse. So I think it's important to test these kids to see if you improve hearing, but the hearing is bad. Or it's in noise, it makes it worse. That's what I was talking about.